I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero. Today we have a pretty interesting conversation. It's going to be the start of a series of conversations I will have with this gentleman. The gentleman's name is Coop. Coop is what you would call an introvert who is very interested and curious in history and philosophy. And he draws a lot of parallels from history to the modern day. And he's very good at diagnosing and dissecting what you see playing out in front of you from a historical point of view. Our mutual friend Gord, who you've heard on the show, introduced us about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. And we started chatting back and forth and decided, hey, man, let's do this. We got a really cool idea for a series that will just keep moving forward. Today, you're going to hear about um, objective reality ideology and how the death of nations and how that all plays in to what we see going on around us in modern times. But before we dig into that, don't forget to visit my Substack, tommysalmons.substack.com, and subscribe, listen, and share this podcast while you're at it. All of my podcasts are up there at tommysalmons.substack.com. So share the podcast. Let's get these numbers up. I've been seeing a lot of increased growth here lately, and it's looking good, man. So I appreciate all y'all listening, and let's just keep it up, man.
All right, man. I'm here with Coop. What's going on, buddy?
Not much, just killing an afternoon here in the middle of lovely Hamilton, Ontario, way to your north, way to your north. So I think, we met like a week ago, something like that.
Oh, well, about a week and a half. Yeah, week and a half ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
And here we are. We're going to do the hard work now, the heavy lifting.
We are. So I think what you like to discuss is the beginning of the great divides that we see in society. We might as well start at a beginning. It's actually a division in how we prioritize value and why that value now seems so separate from the reality that we live in. We've got different components of how we assemble information, or I should say the components of our brain and how we think that allow us to assemble information. And it's kind of like a democracy that works in our head, with each one casting a vote as to what our output is going to be or what is our final thought on it. There are many and they're complex, and how they interrelate, but predominantly we have a conceptual mind and a rational mind. And they both serve their purpose. The conceptual mind of which I speak is born out of the necessity to solve problems, in that we come up with a concept first, and all of this is very, very base, but it has to, I have to establish a footing from where we're going to go, of course. The concepts are evolved out of necessity to solve problems. They are the hypothesis that we apply a scientific method to. And as such, the conceptual mind is the birth of the opinion, so to speak. You have an opinion about how problems should be addressed, about how a solution can come about, and then you test it against the reality of the situation, those limitations, those objective aspects of whatever problem you have. It's got to be looked at it as a tool, and it's probably the tool that we use to the greatest extent, that separates us from other animal species. And the issue is that basically the tools that conceptualization represent are tools that initially were birthed out of the requirements for survival. And when we communicated our concepts to solve these problems, as I said, they're untested subjective opinions of an outcome. Now, we share these with others in a tribal sense to more or less unilaterally determine where resources are going to go regarding who has the best subjective opinion or concept in solving a problem. Now, the issue, again, that we run up against is that as a result of it being an opinion and the result of there being a limited resources, is that only one or two suggestions can potentially be utilized before a solution is found. And nobody wants to be the village idiot in that situation. So we all grow quite attached to our opinions or the ways that we see to go forward, because status ultimately is given to those who come up with the concepts or the subjective notions as to how a solution can be found. And if the solution is indeed found, then that person gets the pat in the back. So we have that's our attachment to our opinions. Now, the issue that we've gone into is the separation from survival that we have in our conceptualization now. We started developing a civilization that created advancements that allowed for us to have leisure time or entertainment, and as such, concepts took on an other than survival purpose for our society. Now, when that happened, yeah.
Real quick, I'm sorry. I just want to when we're talking about concepts and then leisure. There was a period, as you were pointing out, those with the best concepts, those with the best opinions that were able to solve problems were then regarded in high esteem. So the existence of leisure is not always a bad thing. It's just it's the overabundance of leisure. Is that actually what we're getting into at this point now?
Well, it's not necessarily an overabundance of leisure, in the sense that leisure and the allowance or separation of concepts being purely a survival tool, and what it did was it allowed for advances in further leisure to a certain extent. We call them technological advances now. You know, everything in your kitchen nowadays is an appliance that was created by a concept that was created out of leisure in order to create more leisure time.
Right.
Your oven, you don't have to split wood for it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that leisure is a negative thing, but there was a definite divide in society as to who had the leisure and who did not, and certainly that's the beginning of a class divide, where you had wealthy individuals or those that having more leisure time than those whose concepts and opinions still had to be directly applied to survival and directly tested against the reality of their situation, with very dire consequences for making the wrong decision or having the bad opinion or having an incorrect concept because they had limited resources with which to solve problems. The other class of people had the leisure. They were able to make mistakes in their conceptualization. Their conceptualization, their subjective reality, was not attached to survival so much. They could afford to make mistakes in their opinions. They could afford to make mistakes in their concepts. They could screw up left, right, and center, and it didn't make any difference because they were still going to get food on their table. Now, the problem is when you have a status attached to conceptualization itself, still remaining, despite the fact that the conceptualizers did not create concepts that were directly related to survival anymore. So they still were able to gain status due to living in a subjective, conceptualized reality that was separated from survival, despite the fact that it did not necessarily benefit the whole. And so you had the birth of a pondering class who could afford to wither away the days, dreaming about this or that or the other, and didn't have to be concerned about it being tested against reality. And of course, just as I said, they still became very attached to their concepts and their ideas. Nobody wants to be the village idiot. So that kind of brings us up to the point where it starts becoming recorded in history. You could say that it reaches back as far as the biblical story about Nimrod, who created the conceptualization of fear within outlying peoples in order to bring them within the walls of the city that he built. So using the concept of fear and conceptualizations of fear, he was able to bring people under his power. But that's very brutal and direct compared to the nuance that I'm hoping to bring up as it relates to the Greeks and philosophy, where we start getting the first exhaustive dialogues on the differences between objective reality and subjective reality. And that starts with Plato and Socrates, ultimately, or Plato and the Sophists, to be more exact. Plato believed that there was like a hardcore objective reality, that words had a meaning, and that those meanings were universal, if not mutually defined. In other words, two people might not necessarily agree on the meaning of a word, but the intent of the word was that stood outside of both of those individuals' opinions, and they were called the Platonic virtues, so to speak. So there was a good, there was a just, for example, and it was just that humanity applying itself to these things could never actually reach the perfection of those things, but they were nonetheless very real, objective things. The sophists, on the other hand, and you can actually check out Stephen Hicks regarding sophistry. The sophists believe that what was more important than truth, an objective truth, was rhetoric, right? Whether or not you could convince people of what you were saying is true. Relativity, in the sense that everybody has their own truth and it's not necessarily a fixed thing. And retribution, recompense, revenge, any number of these things were used as a conclusion to a rhetorical device. Or it could also be a complaint, because everybody loves complaining and everybody loves hearing people complain, and everybody loves relating to those complaints. So rhetoric was used to convince people of a truth, and then once people believed in that truth, it didn't matter what the actual truth was because it was transitioned to what people believed. The relativity aspect was that there could be no truth ascertained as long as there were individuals perceiving something. And if there were individuals perceiving something, then everybody had a different definition of what they were perceiving, and therefore truth was just relative to your situation. The device of revenge, recompense, and retribution, I think it was more just part of the wrapping up of the rhetoric tool in order to curry favor with the crowd.
Now,
And
were they attempting to diagnose how people acted upon events occurring in their lives, or were they trying to make an objective, absolute, this is all that matters type of argument whenever they were talking about perception equals reality?
Well, the only way that you can perceive rhetoric and relativity as having any meaning at all is if you are in the class of people for whom conceptualization is not attached directly to your survival. Right? Because even it doesn't matter what time in history you go to, right? It is not the people who conceive of the war that fight the war. It is the people that do not have the leisure to conceive that end up fighting the war. Predominantly, wars have been started. Wars were started based upon survival demands, competition for resources. But then, as civilization evolved, wars were fought over rhetoric. People were convinced to go to war by the devices of language, the relativity of the situation. In other words, you had to be relatively better than your enemy in order to feel motivated to go and kill them. You could not perceive them as being the same as yourself. And of course, the final device, we have to get revenge on these people for a perceived wrong. In that sense, truth is out the window. Any real reason for sending young men off to kill other young men, if you want to look at it as an objective, in an objective sense, there is no rational reason for it. So, and that's a bit of a tangent, but sophistry, to a certain extent, is the beginning of political dialogue. In that sense, using words to convince people of a truth, and keeping your rhetoric in a relative or a clouded sense, so that you were not specific, so that people could get whatever truth they wanted out of what you said as it relates to their own perception.
So this would be where the philosophy and the principle goes out the window and the ideology comes in.
This is where it goes out the window. Principles require absolutes. And as much as you can say there are no absolutes, there is that entire fallacy in that saying that you have created an absolute. An absolute is the base requirement for the unity of any and every society. And that absolute is based upon the bedrock reality of survival. And so when people say, oh, well, there are no absolutes, I say, well, you can kind of reverse engineer that from the state of death. Death is an absolute.
Right.
There's no half dead. You are either absolutely dead or you're still alive. So So that is the basis of an objective view that is maintained by a class that is still objectively rooted in decision making and conceptualization and holding opinions on matters which are directly related to their survival. Now, Socrates appears at a time where you had a lot of individuals in a leisure class due to the mercantile explosion of the Greek city-states. So you had a lot of wealthies who had children that were interested in education. So Socrates came up within that group of individuals whom he was instructing. And there were other schools that were still based upon the objective schools of philosophy. And so they went head to head. And I'd like to make note, we don't have anything on the sophists. We don't have very much literature that were written by the sophists. And that is because in the political sense, the objectivists won the argument, which unfortunately, it was too late to save Greece at that point. But nonetheless, they won the argument because of the eventual outcome of the sophist rhetorical device in dissembling Greek society. So it was almost like too little too late did they realize their mistake. So what happened was Socrates started teaching these young men of elite and wealthy families that relativity and rhetoric and subjectivism was a priority concept in developing a proper way to think and look at the world. Now, I'm not going to suggest that it doesn't have its place. It certainly does. It kind of piggybacks on the concept of empathy, being able to understand what another man may be going through, and that it may be the cause of why he thinks differently than you. Mm-hmm. But that goes as far as that class divide, right? Because the class divide also represents a point where you cannot understand or empathize with an individual because you're not relating to the world in the same way.
Right.
So if you have that division in a society and a consequent struggle between who or which school is going to direct society, then you have ultimately created the soup that is going to destroy that society. Now, in my opinion, it's a natural thing that occurs. Any successful society creates a leisure class, and that is the result of success. And as such, every society therefore is going to face that divide. And the natural result is that there is a split in that society, and we've seen empires come and go based along those lines. Although, to tell you the truth, a lot of historians like to cloud it in resource issues, or a grain shipment didn't come in from Africa, or there was a particular war that happened that broke the empire apart, or there was a succession issue. But ultimately,
I was going to say, even if the physical characteristics that created the balkanization or the destruction of that empire, were occurring, they were recurring because of the subjective nature of thought, and the rhetoric that
yes.
was that promoted that type of, it's like when you look at the United States today, the promotion of printing money in fiat currency could very well be the thing that leads to hyperinflation. So the objective reality of hyperinflation is created by the rhetoric that it's okay. Modern monetary theory says it's okay. You can just print your ass off all you want.
Yes, and that's the disconnect. That represents the disconnect that ultimately ran down the center of all collapsing empires. And the issue was not that they had these problems. The issue was not that there was like a war that cracked an empire apart. The issue was not that there wasn't a grain shipment that made it there. The issue was that the dialogue within the people did not allow for a unified response to these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you had the conceptualization of urgency perhaps coming from the objective thinking, survival-based conceptualizers who were looking at starvation very imminently, and those that were wealthy who believed that they could conceptualize a better and more permanent solution, but were not addressing it with the urgency that was required. So in that sense, you had Rome trying to solve the problem of always having a good grain supply, ignoring the immediate shortage of grain, right? And therefore they could not unify the country under any particular argument they may have been having amongst 5 different sects in the Senate discussing this issue. So if we go back to the Greeks in that sense, Socrates was deconstructing the objective reality of his students. He's most famously known for what is called the Socratic method, which is nothing but the deconstruction of meaning. So this is where the postmodernists stole it from, was Socrates. And that Socrates would keep asking the question why, or keep asking one of the 5 W's that were related to whatever was being proposed until whatever question was being asked was distilled to meaninglessness. Now, when you have an apathy generating philosophy like that suggests that everything is subjective and relative, and at the same time suggests that subjective relativity renders everything meaningless, then you have the solvent applied to the glue of a society or a civilization. So the concept of a society or civilization, and therefore any steps taken to maintain its cohesion or for its progress are rendered meaningless. In fact, at that point, you could start, and this is what was applied by postmodernism, and this is the third part of retribution, recompense, and revenge. You can start pointing out how these associations or these objective binding agents within a society are actually oppressing or stopping other peoples and their relative sense of existence from thriving. So once you've made everything meaningless, you can attribute a different effect to whatever apparatus it is that you're describing. As such, the concept of the Greek city-states started to dissolve as a unified structure, and there was a recognition of this as being a negative thing by the people who actually held the power, which were predominantly men that were allowed to vote because they were willing to put their lives on the line to protect the unity of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
and they saw their children being corrupted by meaningless deconstruction of what it is they were willing to lay their lives on to defend. And so Socrates was charged with corrupting the youth. And as such, it's kind of it's been made up as a joke, but it actually had a very real and substantive charge behind it. In corrupting the youth, Socrates was actually charged with a soft form of treason against the state, and that he was creating a generation that would not uphold the values of the state through corrupting their minds by deconstructing the meanings of things that held society together.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can find some parallels in today's university system with that.
Maybe just a little bit, but I
Maybe
think
just a tiny bit.
I think the difference. I think the difference today, though, is that the political system of modern times embraces the corrupting of the youth because they recognize their ability to utilize rhetoric on their own. You know, thanks to people like Edward Bernays, who wrote propaganda, and the understanding of how propaganda and rhetoric can be used to manipulate and steer full complete populations in the direction they want them to be steered in order to gain more power and control.
Well, the escalation of approval of that way of thinking is directly related to the fact that Western civilization today is not assailed by the Persians, the Parthians, the Scythians, or the other major powers that were literally a direct threat to any Greek hegemony in the area. So therefore, our survival requirements are not so much hinging on our unity, or at least that's the way we perceive it, or I should say that's what we've been deceived into thinking. But for the Greeks, that still, that attachment to the objective was still very much relevant to its survival. Its unity was absolutely necessary, despite the fact that they were able to afford the leisure conceptualization through that class divide. It was still very much accepted that they needed warriors, that they needed a unified bloc to stave off the barbarians.
Well, that's
we don't have it. We don't have any barbarians today.
Yeah.
What we have are a lot of people that are bored, and so the realm of conceptualization is allowed to go unfettered and unchecked by any objective reality. In that sense, we've almost hit a point in society where anybody that dares remind us of reality is unpersoned. And that is a great tribute to the damage that has been done to the human spirit since we absolutely required conceptualization as a tool for survival, in that it is the tool of our demise at this point. It's predominance, in that we don't have any more unity. I've talked with several people about this, and I kind of grew up in a small town. Even if you didn't like a person in a small town, it still behooved you to find out the best about that person and bring it forward and bring it out of them whenever you could, because you still required the skills and services that person offered the community. in that sense, you would seek to find the objective points of unity with that other individual, even though a subjective opinion of him was negative.
Yeah, he
And
could have been
in
the
that,
only plumber. He could have been the only plumber in that town. You don't want to be without a plumber, like,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
you're gonna find a way to unify, and you're gonna find a way to work together and live around each other. And this brings us to what we had talked about on the phone before, Dunbar's number, and how the outgrowing that has probably created even more, of this division, and the
yes.
need for tribes to break up,
Well,
and
that's again that going back to that point where a society naturally breaks or is broken is when it becomes so conceptually prioritized that there is no unity, and therefore the extreme objective uh, barbarians come crashing through the gates,
hmm
um, because there is no objective defense of those gates because of that split. So when a society hits a certain point, you have too much leisure time, you start to get a priority and status given to concepts that are not relevant to survival. You still have a class of people that whose opinions and concepts and subjective notions are directly related to their survival, and they usually break off. They usually go their own way. Um, and then that cycle starts again. The conceptualizers that remain, the leisure class, the wealthy, whose concepts are not related in survival, are then taken over by the Alaric the Visigoth and his army, because, as I said, nobody objective is there to lend hand to an objective defense of that civilization. And I
hmm
think that that's kind of a point where we're reaching now, in that the threshold or governing capacity for uh, leisure is kind of uh, hit its point. Um, I've looked at a few indicators of this historically, and it seems to kind of match. Um, I can look at art as we have today. Is It's directly correlated to the degree in which conceptualization has started to poison a society, in that art loses its ability to touch an individual except for through the facetious notion of distraction. And I think it's been called selling out, so to speak, or industrialized music, or industrialized art, or politicized art. Um, the modern art movement, to a certain extent, represents the watershed moment where you had people whose concepts were absolutely unrelatable to anybody who ever worked with their hands, because that's just a fucking banana sitting on a toilet. Um,
hmm
no matter what you say or think that it is, to an objective individual whose decisions to purchase things are based on survival, compared to the individual who will pay $1.5 million for a banana sitting on a toilet because they believe that it means something, represents a very clear indication of a society in decline, right?
You know what I was thinking when you first started talking about art? I was thinking a few years ago. I think it was in San Francisco at one of their art galleries. They had this velvet rope section. It was roped off, and it was a red box, and that's all it was. It was a red
Oh
box,
yeah, yeah.
and it was like, okay, it's a box. So,
It's priceless. It's a priceless work of art,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Um,
Well, you can, this is kind of interesting because this is something that I've looked at over the last few years, and I'm a really big heavy metal fan. All right, so if you look at the metal scene that was coming out in like the 80s, or even the hard rock scene in the late 80s, early 90s in the US, in the 70s, especially the 70s, you were getting these revolutionary bands like Pantera or Alice in Chains, Nirvana, you had Jimi Hendrix. You had all these bands in this 20-year period that were just remarkable. But if you look at the music scene in America today, it's very rare to find an American band that a new upstart, upcoming American band that's anywhere as good as its European counterpart.
It's it's unfortunately shameful, because you got to think in between those periods of time, right, where you have genuine output and industrial output that starts to gain dominance, you have generations of individuals who, through that point in time where they could most emotionally attach to music as an art, like when you're a teenager, you have entire generations of teenagers being denied genuine connection from a genuine artist, and instead they're experiencing that art in an industrial sense, and they blink, and that short period of teenagerhood is gone without them ever encountering a genuine art that is speaking to them. Now, things like that make me sad to think about, but nonetheless, that is part and parcel to the problem when we have the over conceptualization, not related to the genuine or the real, or not related to the objective sense of quality that we all can experience. And this touches actually upon another great discussion about this. It was had by Robert Pirsig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, where his character is a philosophical teacher, a teacher of philosophy, and he hits a point where he is trying to figure out whether or not quality is a subject or an objective thing, because certainly there are quality items, right, that we can see are fashioned with quality. The outcome is a quality item, whether it's a quality hatchet, whether or not it's a quality chair, whether or not it's a quality car. And there are also things that are quality that are purely subjective. And I can say that is quality art, and you can say it's a piece of shit. But quality is still applied to it.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, the argument between the objective and it being hinged upon survival necessity, and the subjective being attached to a tool with which we use to solve problems, rides that line on that same point that is made about quality, in that it has two different aspects to it, and that the best solutions always have a conceptual aspect to it that is necessarily tied to the objective reality of it. And regardless, if you go too far in either direction, in either extremes, you're going to have negative outcomes. Ayn Rand, for example, was an extremely objective thinker, and proposed an extreme objectivism. And what we know from that is that an extreme objectivism leads to a lot of death. Pol Pot was an extreme objectivist, and therefore he slaughtered anybody that even wore glasses because it indicated they might have been a conceptualizer. right? He only wanted people that worked with his hands in the new Khmer Empire,
Right.
right? Not people that solved problems. And I think that that's quite often mistaken, as he looked at these individuals as being potential uh, challengers to his power. He did not look at it like that. He looked at them as being individuals like Socrates, who would eventually erode the glue of the society that he was trying to create. So not a challenge to his power, but a challenge to the environment in which he wished to exert his authority.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's a pretty good indicator. Like, I see a lot of indicators of where history is more or less mainlining a very specific, almost pigeonhole concept of power as being the only dynamic that operates through its ebbs and flows. But you cannot have that individual, almost single-mindedness focus um, take place within such a unique, complex sets of circumstances that history and people and tradition and culture have offered us, and that we're losing a lot when we don't understand the nuances and we accept just the block of history as it's presented to us by, quote, experts, not experts. And that's why I think this argument between Socrates and subjective sophist reality and is kind of overlooked. It's very tied into the way we look at things, to the point where sophisticated is usually associated with people that live in urban areas who are not directly related to working the land with their hands to put food on their table. Sophisticated is from sophist.
Oh, okay.
Where else would you like to?
Well, I was going to say, when you think of like sophisticated, you're thinking of the person that's cultured, that is they're looking, they've been looking to other cultures for these solutions, for these historical solutions, or that is educated in Eastern culture, and brings Eastern art to the West and things like that. You're looking at these people that have the leisure and the income to be able to explore all these different realms whenever you think of it. So they're not living, and I've heard this said before, that when you have enough money, the entire world is your country. You don't have a country.
Yes.
You live wherever you like. And so they can afford to be casual in their thinking, and relative in their thinking, because in their personal lives, the objective law of the land is relative to where they are. I mean, their lives are relative to location, to the weather around them, or the conditions around them. So there's a certain amount of reality that belongs in that conversation. But when you allow that conversation to penetrate, like we were talking about, the academy, and to penetrate the generations, and to start shaping and forming the thought of the entire nation, then you are setting yourself up for disaster, because you are not preparing yourself for the objective realities around you.
That is absolutely correct. However, there is one thing about that: the sophisticated class, right, who have made the world their nation, so to speak.
Mhm.
They do so and freely do so, and are allowed to have their relative viewpoint simply because the individuals whom they hobnob with in those other nations are also individuals of that same leisure class. And if it was an actual a true relativity, right, as opposed to a cloistered relativity, then they would see that the basic issues of survival and why objective reality is more universal is that the people that are in that class whom concepts are still attached to survival all have the same issues throughout the world. They all have the same values throughout the world. The family unit is still valued. It doesn't matter what country you're in, because
Mhm.
that concept of the family unit and the unity within that family unit and the focus of a family unit is very much hinged to their survival. And it doesn't matter whether or not it's working class Philippines or working class Mexico or working class, you name it, right?
Right.
Um, so there is more in common amongst those individuals that are still connected to the objective reality than there is amongst the individuals that embrace relativity and therefore stand as islands unto themselves. So they think. Now
Mhm.
that comes into another topic of the discussion is when you live in a conceptualized reality, or where everything is relative and subject to your perception, um, you do not like being confronted with any reality that is going to oppose what your opinion is. This goes back to what I said earlier about nobody wanting to be the village idiot, and therefore they get really attached to their opinions
Mhm.
in a personal sense. Well, you are more attached to your opinions in a personal sense if they've never been checked by reality. And if you're of the leisure class who lives in that conceptual reality, you have never been checked by reality. And therefore, you associate your opinion as being the predominant means with which you engage the world. So any objection or any affront that anyone or anything proposes to that opinion becomes immediately classified as an enemy of the person, right? You're not just attacking an idea, you're not just approaching an idea going, hey, here's some issues with this. It becomes intensely personal.
Mhm.
Um, it becomes even more so intensely personal when that same individual who has not been checked by reality, and this is attached again to tribalism. If an individual has not undergone an initiation ritual that necessarily binds them to reality, which is the point of an initiation ritual,
Right.
um, then then they are allowed to project themselves through their ego in the same manner that a child does. And they are allowed to maintain that through having their leisure class, through the development of their conceptualized world and reality as unchecked by an objective reality.
Mhm.
And as a result, you start seeing that disdain for the objective class from the conceptual class who make up its leadership. So that's where the disdain for the plebes comes from, is because the plebes do not need the subjective opinions of leaders in order to get by on a daily basis, but those subjective relativists still require the food that the objective realists grow,
Right.
and they despise the fact that reality is a necessity as opposed to not as needed as them or their concepts.
I said it the other day. I said they hate you because they can't live with you, but they can't survive without you.
That's correct. That is correct. And I think we see plenty of examples of that contempt almost on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
Just blatant lying through establishments, with an assumption that that their opinion is overriding what you can see with your eyes.
Right.
And
a lot of people refer to it as gaslighting. Or they're just like it's almost like they're intentionally trying to make you feel like you're crazy, like you're a radical, like you're an extremist, because what you are experiencing on a day-to-day basis is not what they're telling you you are experiencing on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, absolutely. Again, this just leads into all of those steps in the decline of all of those other societies, in that you're not starving, you're still eating mice.
Mm-hmm.
Which, you know, is Rome being besieged by the Visigoths. The leadership.
Well, I mean,
was always
we can look at even as recent as 2 years ago. You can look at the news coverage of Venezuela, and if you look at specific news outlets, they're walking through the grocery stores in the upper class part of town saying, no, there's no food shortage in Venezuela. And then I know a guy, you know, I met a guy through a friend of not of ours, but of mine and Gord, and who lives in Colombia. And he's like, it's distressing to see how these people live. But if you listen to certain voices, you'd never know anything was going on.
Exactly. Now, this is where the light at the end of the tunnel is. Is there is a point where there's a general consensus that enough is enough. And in a society that has had it pounded into it that violence is not an answer, then the only natural response is going to be just ignoring the individuals that are within that conceptual space, that subjective conceptual space.
Right.
And carrying on with life in an objective and real manner, and looking at this collective class of individuals as just being batshit crazy, not worthy of note. And to a certain extent, that has started to happen when you look at the decline of CNN ratings and other major news channels. Their ratings going through the tube because there is a guy sitting in his living room in front of a camera that's a straight shooter, giving people something that is very much attached to reality that they can relate to. And this individual sitting in his living room is getting more views than CNN is. And in that lies the threat. Any establishment, it doesn't matter whether or not it's the Roman Senate, it doesn't matter whether or not it's France just previous to the French Revolution. It doesn't matter. You can take any of those situations. It's not the physical threat that these establishments fear, and by establishments I mean establishments of subjective relativity. It's being ignored. They fear being ignored. Because when they're ignored, then their concepts cannot carry any meaning, no matter what their rhetorical devices are.
Right.
So they rely upon having a bullhorn and an audience. And they clamber to maintain control of the bullhorn under the incorrect auspice that it will maintain the audience. And The fortunate thing is that it just doesn't. The unfortunate thing is that an individual will rise within the ranks of that establishment who simply speaks things the way that they are. And then to that individual, all power is given. And that has been falsely associated with the term populism. Populism has been associated with dictators, strongmen, demagogues, and that's just not the case. Populism is the play that every politician makes with their election promises before the election.
Yep.
They try to make the most populist appeal to people, and then, of course, go back on everything that they promised. When a populist appeal is made and the individual sticks to their promises, that's when they become a threat to the establishment, because they're not playing the game the way they've established that it has to be played.
Right.
Because they are actually taking their rhetoric and what they say and drawing it into an objective reality, as opposed to spinning it off into a subject relativity that has no actual meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Now, regardless of whether or not you want to draw any comparisons to other societies or other social aspects, we are at a point in our society, and we have been here, and we've been here since the 50s, late 50s, early 60s. So we can't fool ourselves into thinking, oh, this has just happened within 10 years. The decline of society and that objective versus subjective argument started with the boom of American society in the 50s, right? After
war. I would strongly relate it to the outsourcing of personal responsibility.
Absolutely.
And in which you started public education began to be the only education available, at least for the vast majority. You had you needed both parents working in a home. It destroyed at least the cohesive nature of the family and what the family actually meant. You no longer had the extended family because people were beginning to travel across the country away from grandparents and uncles and aunts, looking for career opportunities across the country and things of that nature. So that entirety, the entire aspect of that just starts breaking that glue, as you had said earlier. And then you leave an opening for those spewing the most popular rhetoric, sounding the best, appealing to everyone's emotions in the most cohesive manner, to gain power. And you end up with rhetoric like hope and change, where everybody can draw their own interpretation of what hope and change is onto that person, that fixture.
Yes, that's called casuistry.
Yeah, explain that, because we did talk about that.
Casuistry is a rhetorical device that was developed most heavily by the Jesuits as a subversive measure in education. All of the royal families of Europe had their princes and whatnot instructed by Jesuits in casuistry, because it became the means of political discourse through which one could lie or tell the truth without doing either, and its interpretation would be left up to the individual. So, for example, if you said, hey, you should go and see this movie, and I go and see it, and I don't particularly like it, but I don't want to offend you. So you come back to me and you say, did you see it? And I say, yes. And you say, did you like it? and I say, well, it was interesting, you're going to make an assumption that I enjoyed it and that I liked it, even though I said none of those things. Casuistry would be using a neutral term, right, with either an inflection or in a context in which the individual already has a positive assumption towards an answer, right? In that sense, that is the political discourse of not answering a question but appearing to have answered a question. That is the regular meat and potatoes of any politician anywhere saying anything.
Right.
It's no direct answers, and it's used as a diplomatic device, and that's why it was taught to the like elite youth of Europe back when the aristocracy made a difference, as a way to not offend anyone, because slight offenses could end up in huge wars. So it was kind of good to avoid that if you could.
Yes, and there were a couple of huge wars. So
they had a few.
Yeah, we don't want to see any more of those, I promise.
But nonetheless, it is a device that is used against mass populations, to make them think things that just aren't true, but they're themselves to blame for not demanding a concrete answer, right? Which is another way that the elite subjective relativists express their contempt for the people who are still attached to an objective reality. Oh, well, they're not actually demanding an answer. Right.
Yeah.
So
and
clearly,
and this goes everything. I mean, everything from political slogans to the slogan at your local, dry cleaner. They all have these little casuistries. Is that how you say it?
Yes, casuistry.
Yeah.
But
they all deal in that type of language.
That objective and subjective divide is the divide upon which you can put any team or any group or any discourse or any argument or any discussion or any politic or any philosophy. It runs along that same line of divide. It doesn't matter. So in that sense, this is where principles that are based in objective reality have to start coming back into the forefront of those things that we require in order to hold a society together versus various ideologies. If we want to turn it back to the Greek.
Well, hold on. We can turn it back next time because it's been just over an hour, and we're trying
Perfect.
to. Yeah.
So next time
that was a pretty good place to stop.
Yeah, we'll discuss principles and ideology next time.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. A perfect transition point.
All right.
Okay, that was Coop. And I'm sorry about my sound quality. I was trying out a new set of earbuds because my last set got all jacked up, and they just did not connect to my computer well. Did not have a good sound quality from my computer. I will next week. I'm going to start carrying my microphone with me on the road, and we're gonna try to do things that way, and we'll move forward from there. So I do apologize about the sound quality, but I hope you got a lot out of that. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm really looking forward to the next conversation. So again, that was Coop. I am Tommy Salmons. Late.